Many model raretors have more than one favorite locale or interest or era. And generally, with some small changes, your existing layout can actually accommodate most of those without feeling pressure needing to eventually rebuild your layout or spend a lot of extra time and expense. And so today I'm going to discuss eight tips to help that how your existing layout can accommodate those a different time or even a different location. To help illustrate this, I'm going to use this somewhat unfinished module here on my Southern Pacific Produce Railroad, which is available through a playlist I'll be connected to at the end of this video. And this layout is set in 1955 in Portland, Oregon. And so what in front here is kind of represents this scene here. All the major structures are here. So we have my typical freight train pulled by Black Widow, SD7s with a lot of 40-foot freight cars. The industry in the back is in this time is the Oregon Liquor Control Commission's warehouse. So it's going to get a lot of box cars of crates of hard liquor and empties out. And into the right of it, we see the large gas holders for the coal gas production that were quite fixtures throughout the community. First tip here is we want to make sure if you want to represent a certain era, you will need to make sure that you have key equipment changes. So these SD7s were built in 1952. In the Black Widow paint scheme that they're in represents that 50s. The first box car you see, and one of the box cars in the back is actually in the 1955 scheme, where we still had the SP shield on the right of the car, or the left. It may be on the 50-foot car in the back, or in the big, large Southern Pacific, Gothic lettering. So that's indicative of a layout, at least a time period was set in 1955 or potentially later. And paint schemes did last a long period of time, but here you have some key elements that fit into the scene. Now for this scene, we've done some slight changes have occurred here. So now we kind of moved up the timeline a bit to help try to represent the same area, Portland, Oregon here, but now we've moved up 10 years to 1965. So here again, some of those key equipment changes. So the locomotives, the Alco Century C628 in a patch out demonstrator scheme. This is what these represents 1965. These engines were in the demonstrator scheme when they were in 1964, but in 65 they were purchased by the Southern Pacific, and then they were in this patch out scheme for a short while. So this particular scheme sets this in 1965. These engines were usually paired up along in the Oregon's Willamette Valley, usually with like an F7, B unit or A unit in either the Black Widow or the Bloody Nose later from the scheme from 1958. And then some of the cars are representing covered hoppers of later 50s paint schemes that would be appropriate in 1965. And also then our industry in back, our box cars are representing some of the damage-free and hydro cushion box cars that were built in the early 1960s. So here's some of these equipment changes that can be done. Another possibility you can do, and this is actually tip number 2, which just really hardly takes any really effort much at all, is change the building uses. So we said in 1955, our warehouse here was our Oregon Liquor Control warehouse. So it received box cars and then it came out empties. In 1965, that use has changed. It's now actually a publishing warehouse. So in this case, Now we have empties coming in, and then we have full boxcars versus of books going out. So we can change the uses. If you have paperwork for your operating sessions, you can change the names, change it on your paperwork. So you can easily just change it and update it to two different uses. You don't necessarily even have to worry about signs. This building here, this is the back side of the building. There was no signs on the front sides. Typically, most railroad spurs are in the back, so you have to worry too much about signs. However, if you do have period billboards on top, for instance, you can always swap a billboard out and have a 1965 advertisement, for instance, versus 1955 advertisements. And also along this way here, don't forget, if you have automobiles, make sure you change them out. Cars in the past, like cars didn't last as long as they do today. So you would have some 1955 vehicles still around 65, but you have a lot more 60s. Wouldn't have that many of them. Other possibilities, as far as buildings go, is actually is maybe keep the building, maybe it is to use or not, and make it from a rail serve industry to a non-rail serve industry. You can decide to do in your operating scheme, just ignore the spur. And maybe it's it's abandoned. It doesn't exist anymore. You can just ignore it. It's no longer in your operations. Another possibility is to keep it as a storage track. You can have it in such a way that maybe it's used to store cars out of season, like extra refrigerator cars or extra covered hoppers, for instance. You can put some cars waiting for this a seasonal rush. They're just storage. It's car storage, as an example. Or a third possibility is like what I've just shown here, is maybe it's no longer used, but it's used by the railroad to store maintenance away equipment. So here's a dormitory bunk car, for instance, sitting there. So you could use it to pose some maintenance away equipment, for instance, that maybe you don't necessarily have room for in the rest of the railroad. It would be a realistic use. The fourth tip, which is going to be actually building removal or replacement. Again, that's something that could be swapped out. I'd say it's a bit more work because it requires either you have to prepare, make it look like has to be good with the building or without the building, or maybe you put a substitute building in place. So we can see here in the picture here that the gas holder that we had here, it's just a foundation today in 1965. That's because in this area, all these gas holders were, along with the coal gas plants, were decommissioned in 1958 when the coal gas system was turned into the supply system for natural gas. So those gas holders weren't needed anymore, and then the steel structure parts were torn down, leaving the large concrete foundations. In fact, when I was researching this area in the 1990s, those big foundations were still there. The fifth tip here is just some general notice about time periods. And ideally, with time periods, the closer you can have your eras together, there's actually makes it a little bit easier. Obviously for me, like a 10-year gap's easier to handle than if it was 20 or 30, because things do change. It's not just equipment changes or vehicular changes, it's structures or potentially abandonment of areas, things like that. So the further you get apart, generally it requires more of a stretch. Again, with the 10-year mark, there's freight cars from 1955 that are still usable in 1965. So there's more of a allowable use. So maybe I have to pick up some, in this case, pick up some key locomotives and key schemes, but 2/3 of the freight fleet are generally still usable, and I just need to pick up a number of newer cars to fit. Can we turn our layout into a different locale? And yes, you can. And then, of course, this does have some caveats. Obviously, it's going to be more of a stretch than what you had if you're just shifting an era on your layout. If you're modeling prototype areas like where I'm kind of generally doing, not exact, obviously, it's a bit more of a stretch. If you're doing generic scenery, western, eastern, urban, rural, you can definitely make it probably happen a lot easier. So this particular sample here, I also have in addition to my Southern Pacific interest, I do have a lot of interest in the Burlington Northern. In the early 70s, this is the Amtrak Rainbow era. And it's all of its predecessor roads as well, Northern Pacific, Great Northern, etc. And so here I kind of was looking around how to accommodate this on this layout, and I did find that actually the southern part of Seattle runs through a similar industrial area as East Portland. So a lot of older brick buildings, multi-story warehouses, chemical plants and things like that would actually fit well. I found some of my, yards are similar sizes with similar positions of where the engine terminal sits, and there's generally a significant, industries that the flow could be generally changed to fit. And the sixth tip I found, if you keep your secondary railroad actually regional in the same area or some area, a lot of the industries that will actually overlap many times in a regional sense. And I found in my case a lot of food related industries, so like the cereal or flour mills, breweries, cold storage warehouses. A lot of these actually had facilities both in Portland and in Seattle, so the names actually could work in either location. So you can actually use that and use these kind of flexible names as long as the names are generic. And this kind of gets into the next tip, is really wanting to be able to use those generic names. If you use geographic names, if I had East Portland Warehouse or something very, very significant to the local area, if you don't change the signage, it kind of makes it kind of look kind of odd. Last tip here is really, you can also rename features. If you're changing your layout around, you can put things on the fascia, either say with removable. Maybe you got a plate that shows a switching location or a river or a street name. You can just make it. You can add use Velcro and change change it out. For instance, my Brooklyn Yard in Portland would become the 2nd Street Yard. The Holgate Avenue overpass becomes the Spokane Street Viaduct. My staging yard, one of my staging yards that serves some of the branch line east and west side branches in Oregon, we can call that the West Seattle staging, to support all of the non-modeled grain elevators and oil and chemical plants, etc. This way, then here, then I can, if I want to model, SP in the mid-50s, I can do it, or must be in the mid-60s, or change my, layout here to the, quote, Seattle area and model, the BN of the early 1970s. And frankly, though, I actually have enough equipment. If I want to backdate this and model Seattle of 1965 and keep it in Northern Pacific, I have enough Northern Pacific freight and passenger power. I could also do these sub areas. You can slice and dice. Once you have a number of these eras and times set up, you can do a lot of slicing and dicing, and it be more flexible, and you can have a variety of changes, and keep things varied. So if you've done this kind of thing before, please make a comment. We'd like to hear what you've done, or if you have specific things that you've done to best to achieve different times or different locales on your railroad. I'd like to hear it.